Yeah, apologies that last week's talk didn't get recorded because I put one or two things in with a mind to this talk. I've tried to put them back, or one or two hints of them back, to make the talk freestanding, but I've not done all that good a job. It's all my fault. I woke up this morning and there was Lives of Science on the radio, and Alfred Evans was on Lives of Science, and he is a good guy, and I couldn't tear myself away from listening to him, and I recommend you try and find it on the BBC website or wherever it might have got to. It's really, really interesting listening to him for all kinds of reasons, not just the science, but he's a guy of the old school who, sitting there without a yacht because he forgot to patent any damn thing he did, and that was things like CD player lasers and all sorts of stuff, so he missed out. Anyway, I also got in trouble with my email. It doesn't matter at all, but there's no handout today because of that one. But I did get this out, so I have got the text of the talk. And it's a continuation of looking at rationalisation in relation to law, but this time in terms of regulation, and notably the regulation of scientific research. And I did have, this is one of the more close to being finished things that I had available to offer to you. And I even had a title sorted out, which was on the legal regulation of scientific research, or how to co-produce knowledge without knowing what you're talking about. And that will be one of the themes, but there are other themes, unfortunately, in this rather chaotic talk today. As there's no handout, I'll try and mark down how things are going. There's a section called Introduction, and I'm going to do that one first. So,
very logical.
A completely general problem arises in the regulation of expert professionals. External regulators will find themselves lacking the skills and knowledge that their task requires. Extensive legal training does not convey expertise in evaluating the practices that regulators must regulate. Moreover, additional training in technical expertise takes many years, and equally important, it requires assimilation into the relevant expert culture. While you're picking up the new skills and so forth, you have to go native, and that process doesn't always reverse, and certainly can't be guaranteed to reverse when you come out the other end. So either way, whether you try and become expert or shrug your shoulders and do the best job you can without, there is a problem where the regulation of expertise is concerned. And having said what I've just said, you can see that some would argue that no solution to the problem exists, and that this is why examples of the competent external regulation of scientists and engineers are hard to find. And certainly the empirical claim that they're hard to find is a plausible one. For example, if you look in the context of big pharma, most of the actual business of data gathering, interpretation and so forth prior to the licensing of a drug is ordered and carried out by the manufacturer of the drug. Arguably what exists in this industry is self-regulation rationalised as external regulation. And the same can be said of many other areas of technology and engineering, as well as of scientific and medical research. So that is one view. It's not real regulation of experts. It's regulators providing a front for self-regulation. Even so, can you all hear okay in the back? Even so, this is far from being the accepted view of the regulation of technical and scientific expertise. More widespread today are claims that we underestimate the importance of regulators, and even that they should be set alongside researchers as co-producers of knowledge. The proliferation of references to co-production in the literature is widely attributed to changes in the actual practice and organisation of scientific research over time. There's a secular trend toward co-production, as is said. But my own guess, and it's no more than a guess, is that it's primarily an expression of new epistemic preferences in the wider society. In a society with growing distaste for strong disciplinary boundaries, the exclusivity of science and so forth, and with these being just part of a larger secular trend away from a culture of deference, respectful of status distinctions and hierarchy, talk of co-production has been encouraged. To refer to co-production is to enhance the epistemic standing of non-specialists and ordinary people, and to set them more on a par with natural scientists and other specialised knowledge producers. Of course, this doesn't mean that accounts of co-production are wrong, and indeed I'm going to go on to cite examples of scientific knowledge that is well understood as co-produced knowledge. Incidentally, whilst I don't think accounts of co-production are wrong, I do myself happen to think that the idea that they've only turned up recently because science has changed isn't correct. I think if you look back into the history of science, it was ever thus, but it wasn't as much remarked upon in the past as it has become remarked upon. But that's an aside. Okay, so we've got the self-regulation view, regulators do nothing by way of genuine regulation, and we've got the co-production view, regulators do so much, you should reckon they're co-producing knowledge along with scientists. Incidentally, it's a very happy talk to end on today. At the end, you'll find that everybody turns out to be right, and that will show you why I'm no public intellectual. I shouldn't be ending talks like that, but there we are. So, at this point, I've now got to clarify what precisely co-production is supposed to mean. And there are two accounts in the literature involving different conception of what it consists in. On one account, co-production occurs when scientists collaborate with outsiders in the generation of knowledge of nature. Outsiders here may be expert professionals of other kinds, or regulators, or ordinary members of society. But the basic idea is that carriers of different forms of existing knowledge and competence must increasingly collaborate in the production of new knowledge. At first sight, the alternative account is very different. Largely deriving from the work of Sheila Jasanoff, who speaks of natural order being co-produced along with social order in and through the same activities. Co-production is defined not as the joint activity of different kinds of agents, as in the first account. It's defined as a form of activity that engenders two products, natural order and social order, or knowledge of nature and knowledge of society, if you will. Fortunately, however, these accounts differ less than it may seem, and I have no need to decide between them here. They're not actually incompatible, and many case studies, including Sheila Jasanoff's own studies of the legal regulation of scientists, exemplify both of them at once. So I can use exemplary cases and allude to both of these accounts as I go along, indirectly through them, though it's nice if you recall that these two accounts have been mentioned as relevant. So I'm almost ready to move on to examples, but there's one last thing I need to do. I need to enter a couple of reservations about both of the general accounts I've alluded to just now. First of all, they almost always employ co-production as a valorizing term. It is a good thing. Here is an example of this good thing, is the tenor of the literature. And there are important examples that are not discussed where co-production has clearly been harmful. One example. Biological methods of identifying kin relationships and methods involving subjective reporting from family members, whether directly and verbally or as ticks on forms subsequently processed by bureaucrats, these are known to give markedly and systematically different results. So, for example, where fathers are concerned, a lot more people believe that the father in the household that they relate to in role is their biological father than turn out to be biological fathers if you actually work with biological methods to figure out the relationship. Now, biologists, of course, are interested in kin relationships as biological phenomena, but they nonetheless use data from subjective reporting in generating knowledge of this biological relationship. So, ordinary members of families, bureaucrats, and biologists co-produce biological knowledge of kin relations. And this is not a good thing, but nobody particularly discusses it as an example of co-production, which is a good thing. So there is a quite straightforward example of this kind of thing. So that's a limitation of vision that needs to be corrected. But there's another and more important reservation that I need to enter. There are ways of reading both of these accounts in the literature that make it very hard to imagine how they could possibly be incorrect. So, for example, scarcely any scientific knowledge is or ever has been produced entirely by scientists, even though scientists have tended to get sole credit for it. Certainly, laboratory technicians have long made vital contributions to laboratory research, as have others in remote locations, manufacturers of instruments, suppliers of reagents or organisms on which to experiment, and so forth. Similarly, wherever scientific research is done, social order as well as natural order is constituted by the activity involved. Even if it is only, and in truth it never is only, but even if it is only the social order of the laboratory itself. You can't do research without constituting social order. It's a collective business, and without social order there's no such thing as scientific research, and all you've got to do is take an interest in things with your mates, and you'll generate social order as you continue that interest in things and objects or whatever. And this is a straightforward point, which, as I say, makes it hard to think, well, how in formal terms could this account be wrong? There seems to be nothing not quite right about the way these accounts have been formulated. So that's the final reservation, and I'll leave it there for later discussion in the talk, okay? Sorry, was there somebody? No? Okay, that's the end of the section called Introduction on the non-existent handout. The next section is called Brown Sword on Judge-Made Law and Human Cloning. And you may remember I made reference to judge-made law last time. I think even those of you who weren't here last time will in any case know what it is. I'm going to look at an example in Brown Sword's fascinating paper on regulation, lawyers, and technological change, which has got some fine examples in it. Now, Brown Sword's entire paper is worth a detailed read. It includes a general discussion of judge-made law, which treats it as a familiar and perfectly acceptable component of law, doesn't need apologising for, as far as he's concerned, but it's not the only component of law. And the question for Brown Sword is, when should judges apply law literally? He believes in literal description. And when should they go all creative and effectively become legislators themselves, making it all up as they go along? That's his question. And the need to go creative, he suggests, arises when laws and regulations become disconnected from the activities they were formulated to apply to. And one crucial area where disconnection is unfortunately frequent, and what Brown Sword calls regulatory voids are liable to appear, is the area of technology. Technological change rattles along at such a rate that existing regulatory categories constantly lose their grip on it, and legislators cannot move quickly enough to fill the voids that keep appearing in consequence. So it's particularly likely that judges will need to make the law up as they go along when they're confronted by technological change. So you guys in technology remember this item and think of getting some brown paper envelopes if ever you need to go to court, because the judges will, as like as not, be making it all up as they go along. And Brown Sword's paper is full of illustrations of cases drawn from IT and biotechnology, where law had to be creatively decoupled to the technology in question. Recoupled, did I say decoupled? Sorry. Recoupled, reconnected to the technology in question. And among these examples is a detailed analysis of one of the most striking examples of rationalising argument you could ever wish to encounter. And I couldn't resist citing this example in the paper. Now, the scene is set here, the scene's set by the development of a new technique, cell nuclear replacement, or CNR, whereby the somatic cell nucleus can be placed in a denucleated egg cell to produce a complete cell capable of developing into a fully formed organism. CNR was the method employed just down the road to produce Dolly the sheep, and that was in 1996. Dolly was the first cloned mammal to be produced from an adult somatic cell. And as the significance of this sank in, the possibility of imminent human cloning entered the minds of politicians and legal authorities, and an urgent need for regulatory intervention was recognised. The obvious way to proceed was to involve the HFEA, the Health Fertilisation Embryology Authority, very well regarded authority that already regulated research on eggs, embryos, and other non-personal forms of human life, as Habermas puts it. But the remit of the HFEA was defined in unfortunate detail and even more unfortunate precision in the Act that set out what the HFEA could and could not do. And the need to categorise CNR cells and subsequent developments thereof as embryos was in a certain tension with the definition of embryos for the purpose of the Act, wherein live human embryos were embryos wherein fertilisation has been completed. No fertilisation was involved in the production of CNR cells. And accordingly, the High Court found that the HFEA had no standing in relation to CNR cells. And this seemed to leave human cloning by use of CNR wholly unregulated and entirely legal. And panic quickly set in at the prospect of the immigration figures shooting sky high, boosted by an influx of human cloners looking for a favourable environment. It was clear that something had got to be done, and done quickly. Well, fortunately, the judges rode to the rescue in this hour of need. The High Court ruling was quickly reversed, and in double quick time, a House of Lords judgment confirmed the reversal and concluded the legal process. Now, of course, the detailed judgment had to deal with the awkward problem that embryo in the Act is defined as meaning a fertilised entity and embryo CNR style as no fertilisation. The judges found themselves having to say that Parliament had approved a written formulation of what embryo meant, yet hadn't intended it to mean what had been written in the formulation. Still, anything is okay in a good cause, and a bit of creativity can involve paradox, contradiction, whatever you like, and here it is. Even so, it's clear that Brownsword himself is a bit sniffy about the judgment and thinks it falls below the best professional standards of rationalising argument. He regrets it wasn't better fashioned. In his extended forensic examination of the judgment, he comes close to suggesting that it is too obviously a single-issue fix-up job crafted with undue haste. I'm sorry I can't go into the detailed judgment, but it's a great read, and by the time you've read Brownsword on it, his conclusions seem very reasonable indeed, although if you want then to reread Brownsword himself as offering a rationalising argument, that's also a very good exercise. The present salience of the judgment, though, should be clear. Whether you believe in the possibility of literal description or not, and I'm not, it should prompt the thought that the power of law is the power of lawyers. If they can extemporise on law when they're minded to and rationalise it to the extent that they do in this case, what restraint upon them can written law place? Surely all that will restrain them are other loci of power, and no doubt they consistently attend to those as they apply and invent the law. And of course these other loci, through their demands and requirements, including requirements for consistency and predictability, are going to inject a certain recognisable pattern and predictability into its application, even when judges are doing their creative thing. As to the salience of the example overall, it's interesting that it involves judges considering the characteristics of objects of scientific research. Indeed, of objects created in the course of it, specifying how they are to be treated by researchers and how researchers are to be treated by lower-level regulators, even indicating how objects are to be categorized. For legal purposes only, it could be argued that scientists find themselves having to adopt legal categories, or at least being well advised to, because it does help to stay legal when you do research, or at least to appear like you've stayed legal, not to be found out, and this affects esoteric activities like research, even to the level that they will adopt categories from the courts. So it seems perfectly defensible to see this case as an exemplar of lawyers involving themselves with scientists in the co-production of natural order, even if in a certain clear sense they don't know what they're talking about. The clear sense being they haven't been down there, looked at that, done it all, and so forth. But in fact, I chose a bad example for illustrating this particular point. I just couldn't resist the rationalising argument. It is really a one-off rationalising argument. It's amazing. The trouble with the actual example is that in the late 1990s, the human CNR cells that created such anxiety had not yet actually been observed. For some unknown reason, it wasn't as easy to make human ones as sheep ones, and they remained unobserved for many years. When I last checked some time ago, there were some reports of human CNR cells more credible than the usual disreputable nonsense that you do get. But there were no reports of cells capable of developing into Dolly the human. Incidentally, Dolly the human was the individual who Dolly the sheep was named after. That is an interesting story, but never mind too much an interest in Bransell's book. Anyway, the thing is, because of the long period after the judgment, where the things it was supposed to apply for didn't exist, it's quite difficult to illustrate the importance of law on the practice of scientists with this example. In terms of relevance to legal regulation, I'd have done better to choose another example, GMOs, for example, or stem cells. And indeed, GMO is no natural kind category. It emerged, or perhaps we should say it was co-produced, as the outcome of tortuous negotiations between lawyers and regulators, politicians and social movement activists, ordinary members of society and scientific researchers. And it quickly became the target of regulation and legislation. Indeed, GMO is best understood as a regulatory category, GMOs being regulatory objects, all alike only by virtue of being the subject to the same legal regulations. Whilst we can acquire empirical knowledge of them, we can't expect that knowledge to apply to all of them. Empirical characteristics are not definitive of what those objects are. It's their being subject to legal regulation of a specific sort that labels them for that purpose, GMOs, that makes them what they are. Even so, scientists down the laboratory refer to GMOs in the course of their work, do research on them, get to know things about them, and so forth. It's just that in doing that, they do not merely help to produce natural order, they help to co-produce natural and social order, much as Sheila Jasanoff describes. Okay, that's the example. One main example, two examples waved at. The next section is called Natural States and Legal Statuses. And this is one of the ones where I'd banged a bit of material in last week's talk to help shorten this one. There's a clear and valid sense in which our current knowledge of both non-personal forms of human life and genetically modified organisms has been co-produced, in part through the activities of scientists and regulators as research and its regulation has proceeded. Even so, talk of co-production here can still sound distinctly odd. The scientists working on any of these objects must surely be tempted to wonder whether lawyers, and especially perhaps judges, know the first thing about them, and to conclude that at least in some cases they don't. Certainly it's worth asking how many of them have been down the lab, taken a look at what goes on, messed with the techniques and instrumentation employed, the testing procedures, tried to take a look at the objects themselves, if they're that sort of object, and have been identified, and so forth. Perhaps this sort of thing ought commonly to be done, but it's not. You'd think anyone worth calling a co-producer of knowledge might do it. But of course, it's not just that regulators might be alleged to be co-producers. As I started the talk by saying, regulators are sometimes alleged not even to be regulators in this hand-on sense at all. Rather than jumping to conclusions, however, let's imagine how co-production involving scientists and regulators tends to spin out. It may be that researchers make objects or foresee the possibility of making them and realize they're in need of regulation. This need will emerge as they're doing research, learning empirical things, developing ways of talking about the object, and so forth. At some point, regulators are filled in, get to know what's going on, and their task is then primarily to order activity by human beings around the new objects. That's what their task, in fact, mainly is. This may involve extensive modification of the initial classification, even a radical reconceptualization of what the initial classification of the objects should be. An extensive modification of the initial classification of the objects, changing accounts of what it should really be, in order, for example, that they're more readily separated into dangerous and less dangerous kinds, or kinds suited to different uses, or kinds that attract different levels of support or hostility from political and economic interest groups. This does happen. It happened with GMOs. The names that have been applied to the sort of things currently called GMOs are legion, and they might have started life in laboratories, but the regulatory input has been fascinating to study. What legal professionals do here is what they do elsewhere. They order objects into statuses which identify not the empirical states and propensities of the objects, but how they are to be treated, how people should orient themselves towards them. This is what legal professionals are equipped to do and skilled in doing. In normal circumstances, lawyers will simply accept scientific expertise on empirical matters, on the state of the objects, they'll build decisions on that, but the decisions will be to attribute this or that status to them, whether generally or as part of a localized regulatory process. Now, I've put in a quick digression on status. It'll have to be very quick given the way the time's going. Sorry about this. It's very important you get the hang of this notion of status as referring to something as appropriate for treatment in a certain way. How do you check the correctness of that? Not by looking at the something, but looking round it. And if the people are treating it in the way that corresponds to the status designation, and you've made that designation, you know you've made it correctly. The referent is actually other people referring and acting toward the thing. So at the collective level, statuses are self-referential and self-validating classifications. If everybody does it, that's what makes them valid. That's what you should refer to check on their validity. The paradigm example, take the term target. We apply the term target to physical objects just as easily as we apply them to physical objects. No hassle at all. We just do that. You go to the pub, the dartboard is a target, it's a physical object, thus, and you treat it as a target. In other contexts, a ridge 2 kilometres long and 500 metres high is the target for the artillery company. Blast Hill 17, folks. And by treating it to a barrage of artillery, it confirms that is indeed the target. And a target is a paradigm of a status term. Right? It tells you nothing to say something is a target about the thing itself. It tells you about the people around. It's quite different. And yet, we feel like it's the same. You know, there's your target, Fred, you know, aim at that. Or even abstract nouns, you know, the company's profit target this year is 5 million. Okay, you managers, aim at that. And it orders activity. And that is what happens when you ascribe statuses. You're ascribing self-referring and self-validating terms. Now, unfortunately, it's very hard to get the hang of it, and they get reified. And even reification even occurs amongst lawyers who use these terms all the time, and among scientists. You know, they talk about GMOs, and some of them have a very realistic view of GMOs indeed. You know, it's not us, it's the O's, it's the organisms that make them genetically modified and so on. So much for the digression. Really needed it, I think. In fact, I hope you've written it down because it's so useful in so many unresolved research situations. And if you're into things, you might find you can work with that. Anyway, in brief, there seems to be a division of labour operative here between scientific professionals who construct authoritative versions of natural order by classifying objects in terms of state, that's physical propensities and properties of the thing, and lawyers who create order in action distributed around the objects by classifying them as statuses, in status, as it were. And where ordinary members are willing to be guided by the initial legal status order created around an object, that initial order becomes an authoritative elaboration of the social order entire, as it were. Ordinary people will take their guide from legal authority in those cases, and the status designation will expand across the collective. And again, the same problem arises as it expands. People haven't got it figured as a status notion. Very difficult notion. So they reify it. And reified notions of status are all over the place. And you need to de-reify them to do good analysis. Now, much of interest follows if the division of somewhat of this sort exists. First of all, we can see clearly that the view that experts self-regulate has got a lot going for it. If you're only talking about objects as a lawyer in a way that means you're really talking about other people and not the object at all, then you're not very well equipped to go in there and do hands-on regulation and make sure that the lab assistants are working okay and all of that sort of thing. And indeed, you're not. Technical experts do self-regulate at the hands-on regulatory level. And lawyers do little more than ratify, codify, and rationalise self-regulation. And although that does account for how they're able to talk about the things of which they know nothing in a certain degree, is scarcely what you would call the co-production of knowledge. It seems somewhat of a stretch from that modest contribution to co-production. At the same time, however, we've now seen another role altogether for lawyers and regulators, that of assigning statuses and ordering actions around objects. And here's a much more important way in which they can talk about things of which they know nothing. Indeed, the great value of classification by status is precisely that it allows us to communicate with each other and coordinate our actions around things with regard to objects of which we know nothing. It's the terrific virtue of the invention. Objects or individuals of which we know nothing, or about which there is conflict and division in what we reckon to know, can be spoken about by agreement and action coordinated in relation to them, notwithstanding. Truly, the gift of being able to classify by status has been one of the most valuable in the entire evolution of human beings, conferring a means of creating cooperation out of conflict and an increase in powers of cognition vaguely reminiscent of that conferred by a move from arithmetic to algebra. Talking about things about which you know nothing is redolent of talking about x plus y equals and so forth, and it's a great thing to do, and a lot can be done that way. Even so, the standing of lawyers as designators of statuses within a division of labour where scientists investigate the states of things isn't one favourable for co-production. And one might think it's the imperfections of this division of labour and interactions across boundaries that makes for co-production as a matter of fact. When scientists incorporate legal and regulatory categories like GMOs into their discourse, as routinely happens in many, many cases, certainly happens quite routinely all over the place in medical research, that they incorporate legal categories and for that matter, of course, ordinary members' own informal moral categories as well. Then we can speak of that as co-production in a certain sense. And perhaps this happens often enough for us to say that co-production is normal, at least in the biological science areas and the area of most technologies, and to agree with Sheila Jasanoff that much is missed by accounts of science, law and other activities that fail to attend to this activity. And the final section is called some very tentative concluding remarks, and I've left them to the end. This is the most empirically inadequate part of the talk. Some of the suggestions I make, well, all of the suggestions I make are going to have exceptions. These are not compelling generalizations. They're what's typical, what might be widespread or usual that I'm talking about. So, even at the end of the discussion, having concluded that accounts of co-production are perfectly defensible, I personally remain uneasy with them. And I want to try and put my finger on why I'm uneasy, and why I suspect that some others might be uneasy as well. The unease, I think, arises because in cases of co-production I've looked at, and certainly in cases involving researchers and regulators, epistemic authority remains with the technical experts. Regulators and others may decide how a given categorization of objects should be revised to fashion it into a status ordering, but they don't revise what's actually known about the states of the objects themselves. Still less, they won't revise the methods that the technical experts use to identify the objects as such objects and to do research on them. Epistemic authority apropos physical objects, including human bodies, is acknowledged to remain with the scientists. The scientists are not merely accorded this authority, they insist on it, or try to. In their dealings with outsiders, they tend to be quite easygoing in the categories they're ready to accept for discursive purposes. Even among themselves, they're willing to use regulatory categories descriptively, as I've described. Since these categories tend to be status categories in reified form, we could perhaps say that in these cases, scientists are easygoing in the ontologies they're willing to accept and deploy. And you find them being themselves enthusiastic realists when they turn from their own peers and start writing popular science. And all kinds of reified categories are then rushed in and deployed for the sake of easy intelligibility, let us charitably suggest. But scientists aren't easygoing to the same extent about epistemologies. That is, about ways and methods of knowing. They have their own, those of others they are sniffy of. On the whole, of course, it's as epistemic authorities that scientists have a well-defined standing in the occupational structure. And it is epistemic authority that they take care to preserve, even, we might say, to monopolize. I think, indeed, the term monopolize is appropriately used in that context. Now, since epistemic means pertaining to knowledge, the claim that lawyers are involved in knowledge co-production is reasonably understood as claiming that they're making an epistemically salient contribution to it. And indeed, it's not merely that this is a reasonable understanding, it's surely the only reasonable understanding around at the moment. For if one drops the assumption of epistemic salience, knowledge production becomes a contingent chain of historical links and causal connections, extending to most everything. Take out epistemic statements, salience, just look at what had an effect on the knowledge production process, and what you get. All activity causally antecedent to a given item of knowledge then has a right to be included in accounts of production. The support offered by families for knackered researchers, the support given by instrument manufacturers and those who finance them. Even the hunting and gathering, and of course the sexual coupling of distant ancestors of the researchers are causally involved in knowledge production. Our actual and perfectly sensible decision to ignore all these things implies a presumption that epistemic salience is implicit when knowledge production is spoken of, just as you'd imagine from the very meaning of the term. And it's the clash of the co-production studies with this implicit presumption that makes many accounts of the co-production of knowledge sound strange. And my guess is it's not just me, that natural scientists will think, now this is a bit weird, I don't figure this, and it's this same response to the lack of willingness to take account of epistemic salience. If knowledge production encompasses only epistemically salient activities and contributions, then lawyers and regulators don't figure in the co-production of natural knowledge, not even of GMOs or CNR embryos. They have a sort of ontological contribution there. What those objects really are, as it were, might even be agreed by scientists, the reified status terms moving over. But their role is vastly overblown if they're referred to as co-producers, just as the role of financiers and food providers would be. Although certainly a case could be made in the other direction, where laboratory technicians are concerned. I think anybody who wants to be open to the view that laboratory technicians co-produce scientific knowledge in laboratories along with the scientists who get the credit should expect to find some interesting positive evidence for that hypothesis, and I do recommend it as something very well worth doing. I'm not against co-production at that level. It's the studies. There is here an overlooked source of epistemic input, I think. But lawyers and regulators and their ontological inputs are very different. They may indeed affect scientists, but in the kind of context I've discussed, they affect scientists rather like whoever cooks their breakfast affects scientists. You recall Judge Wendell Holmes from the last talk. Just as Judge Wendell Holmes retained his legal authority even after digesting his breakfast, so do scientific researchers retain their epistemic authority even after digesting the ontological inputs of lawyers. Now, of course, these criticisms only apply to us in a straightforward way, only apply to the first account I gave of co-production as collaboration between regulators and researchers. They're not so straightforwardly applicable to Sheila Jesanoff's account. And indeed, it's not completely clear that they're inconsistent with that account, depending on how you interpret that account. Even so, there's an obvious tension between what I'm saying and what Sheila Jesanoff is saying. I felt unease at descriptions that feature, I felt unease at descriptions that fail to include discussions of intellectual division of labour and the distribution of epistemic authority. But there are many valid descriptions of empirical states of affairs, and Jesanoff's is perhaps an alternative valid description or defensible description to the one I prefer to give myself. Sheila Jasanoff has a specific aim, and her description is informed by it. It's the aim of changing, indeed levelling, the distribution of epistemic authority that I'm interested in as an empirical phenomenon in society, and of weakening the monopoly of scientists and technical experts over major parts of that. She wants to level authority so that ordinary people are up there as well, and as a lawyer she has intriguing interest in where lawyers stand in all this. And of course the levelling of hierarchies as a project just does produce an inclination to materialism. In raising up the bottom of the hierarchy to be level with everywhere else, one raises up what lies at the very bottom of the great chain of being, supposedly inert matter. To shift up the workers and the tea producers and all of the ordinary people in life epistemically to the level of professional specialists, you collapse the whole of the great chain of being, at the bottom of which is inert matter, and materialism is a common result, even if you're only wanting to elevate the lower layers of people. So this is a problem that Sheila has, I think, but I think she'll be able to deal with the matter of Wendell Holmes's breakfast in due course, if the need ever arises for her. At that point, I apologise for overrunning by 2 or 3 minutes. I finished.